it's 2025 and it's time to say goodbye for us here from Putschcast. But we won't be gone for long because in January new episodes are coming up. One about Thomas Müntzer, for example. Who's Thomas Müntzer, you asking? Well, you have to find out by listening. So join us again in January. But for now, we've got a special episode planned. Our first ever annual review 2025. Yeah, it was a long year and a lot has happened in world history. And as the title suggests, we are focusing on coups, putches, revolutions, riots and rebellions. And the four of us are in the studio today. If you want to know who we are exactly, you can do that by visiting our website, putschcast.com. But we got to pick an episode each. An episode, I mean an event. And we've got some really, really interesting topics there for you. We'll kick off with South Korea, a country you usually don't associate or think about when it comes to a coup, but there was one exactly 12 months ago. And then we're staying in Asia and we're moving to Nepal to see what happened there in September when a bunch of young people on social media made world history. We're then heading south to Africa, to a country called Madagascar. I'm sure you know it. It's the world's fourth biggest island, I think. And we're staying in Africa with Guinea-Bissau, which was the latest coup that happened. But in the meantime, there was another one, which we won't be able to cover. And this is a little disclaimer here at the start, because we're not the experts. We're just some people who are interested in world affairs, and we do as much research as we can. And today we don't have an expert. We don't have a guest on the studio. It's the four of us, the four Putschcasters, and I'm excited to welcome them all now to our last episode of the year. Hello, Dave.
Hello, Oliver. Hello, Dave, and hello, James, and the listeners.
Hello, Oliver. Hello, Dave. Hello, Dave. And hello, the listening public.
Hello, Dave. Hello, Oliver. Hello, James, and everybody out there listening.
Again, this is a bit of a different episode today, different format as you know it. But we've been live for about 2 months, I think. It's been 2 months that we've released our first episode. The feedback has been incredible. We have had some interest from across the globe, truly. I welcome you all around the world. The ones who are listening to us right now from wherever you are, please give us a like and leave a comment if you want.
South Korea's capital descended briefly into chaos after an extraordinary move by the country's president to declare martial law. Troops and protesters rushed to Seoul's parliament building, but just as suddenly as the crisis started, it was over.
David, 12 months ago, there was an event in South Korea and the whole world was looking at Seoul.
Yes, I do remember following it in the news. A country which we see today as a world leader in terms of technology and pop culture. Relatively stable liberal democracy for the last 40 years, but they did have a number of military coups after the end of the Second World War and the birth of the nation. So I think what we'll do to set the scene is to talk about the emergence of South Korea as a sovereign state and give a feel for some of the tensions that preceded this particular coup, or self-coup, as it's been labelled by political scientists around the world.
Fascinating topic, self-coup. I've never heard of it until today. Maybe we'll touch on it, but I'm sure we dive deeper into that topic. It's fascinating. So take us back to what happened 1 year ago.
Okay, so 1 year ago, just as a brief overview before we get into the background, the president of South Korea made an attempt, due to his plummeting popularity and corruption investigations focused on him and his wife, to extend his power and override the legislature, dominated by the centre-left Democratic Party in South Korea. He is a conservative president, elected directly. He made an attempt to quash their pushes for reform. And it was a coup, or an attempted coup, that lasted about 2 hours. Some people say 4. But it is interesting to talk about what precipitated that and also the wash-up and how he's going now in terms of what's happening.
What did you guys think last year when you heard South Korea in the news because of a coup or attempted coup or whatever, self-coup, whatever it was? Do you remember?
I do remember, and it definitely took me by surprise. South Korea strikes me as a place where things are relatively stable and steady, and to allow this level of, disorganisation to kind of creep into the senior levels of politics took me by surprise.
I was a bit confused about it. Like, just listening to Dave talk about it in terms of, like, was it a 2-hour coup or was it a 4-hour coup? I mean, it was kind of a little unclear as to what was happening. Like, was it actually a real coup or was it not a real coup?
That's a very good question. The military were involved, so they were ordered by the president, and I'll touch on this a bit later. They were ordered by the president to surround the Legislative Assembly to prevent the Assembly from voting to lift martial law. They were given explicit orders to prevent the vote from happening by any means, including resorting to gunfire, physically dragging these people out of the Assembly. That didn't actually happen in the end. The orders were not followed, and we can talk about the reasons why in a bit more detail in a second.
Today's Putschcast episode is brought to you by Motorcycle Rental Melbourne, your ticket to an amazing adventure on two wheels across Australia. Motorcycle Rental Melbourne is your gateway for the most spectacular way to explore the fifth continent. Visit motorcyclerentalmelbourne.com.au to check out the fleet. Don't forget to mention Putschcast for a 10% discount on your next rental. Terms and conditions apply.
South Korea emerged from an era of harsh Japanese colonization between 1910 and 1945. So at the conclusion of the Second World War, Korea emerged as an independent entity, a sovereign state under US administration, but there were competing ideological entities in the north and the south, and they could not agree on how to run the country, and both of them claimed legitimacy to rule. That sort of festered and then turned into the Korean War, 1950 to 1953, which ended in a stalemate, and what we know as North and South Korea were established, and relatively stability between those two countries. I mean, you've got the DMZ, etc., and some ongoing hostilities, but those two entities exist today. So what happened, it was nominally democratic for a few years, but then the country slid into authoritarianism under Syngman Rhee, and there was a military coup in 1961 led by General Park Chung-hee, and he did it in response to failed reforms in the country. There was a military dictatorship in South Korea from 1961 until 1979. Park was actually assassinated by his spy chief, even though it was a time of rapid economic development, and the things that we know as chaebol now, which are those massive industrial conglomerates, things like Samsung, etc., were established. So it was very rural in terms of its economic policies. You would say that the living conditions improved dramatically, but at the same time there was still dissent and a lot of unhappiness with how things were running in terms of freedoms for people. And then between 1981 and 1987, they were still under military rule, but regime collapsed under significant public pressure. What is referred to as the June struggle, but that was because of lack of democratic reform. And this was one of those, not a coup, but a transition of power was handed back to the people, and the republic and their current system of government was reestablished. So they have a president, they have a legislature, and they have a judicial branch as well. And so there are those checks and balances in Korea. So from 1987 until today, stable liberal democracy, dominated by the conservative side of politics. And to try to get us up to answer James's question, Yoon Suk Yeol, who is the man we're talking about, he was elected in 2022 as the leader of the Conservative Power Party. Narrowly elected, though, he only won a majority by 0.7%. In 2024, the National Assembly elections took place, and that resulted in the majority for the centre-left Democratic Party. So the tensions there started to emerge between Conservative president and a centre-left Democratic Party. He promised to run an open government. He vowed to correct what he felt were the shortcomings of the previous progressive regime. However, there was democratic backsliding. It seems like these leaders often in Korea fall back on more authoritarian ways of managing public dissatisfaction, and he politicised the security sector, and there were a number of corruption probes, especially focusing on his wife. His popularity plummeted. And so to answer your question, James, on the 3rd of December last year, so just over a year ago, at 10:23 local time, or Seoul time, he declared martial law in a bid to rid, and these are his words, rid the opposition of anti-state influence and North Korean elements. Troops were ordered to surround the National Assembly to prevent these members from voting on lifting the martial law. But citizens, alerted by social media and also the media itself, traditional media, they flocked to the National Assembly to protest the move. So you have troops who've been placed around the National Assembly, I suppose the centre of power, legislative power, but then you also have thousands and thousands of South Korean citizens as well. They're protesting and protesting vehemently. It wasn't violent initially. But there was a lot of pressure from civil society for the president to sort of rescind his decision to issue martial law.
Is he in jail now?
He is, yeah. So subsequent investigations, as we mentioned before, at about midnight, he ordered the troops to enter and, again, stop the vote from happening by any means possible. The quote is, break down the doors, even if it means shooting, and even if martial law is lifted, I just have to declare martial law 2 or 3 times, so keep going. That didn't happen. I could not find anything about decision-making amongst commanders within the army about why they didn't actually follow that order. But I think there's something to be said about the number of people who were outside and probably the pressure that they felt that if we do take this action, then it could sort of escalate into something significant, maybe widespread bloodshed. And again, this is just me hypothesizing that maybe they were just not prepared to do that. Obviously, his move was denounced by the opposition and all of the cabinet ministers, including the Prime Minister, they tendered their resignations and the Assembly voted. They voted to lift martial law. So, yeah, they managed to counter this self-coup attempt within whatever it is, this time frame of 2 to 4 hours. So he was impeached on the 14th, so quite quickly, so within about 10 days, and suspended from office. And then in April this year, there was a unanimous 8-0 vote by the Constitutional Court that upheld his impeachment, and he was removed from office. First ever sitting South Korean president to be arrested, and he's detained. He's still in jail at the Seoul Detention Centre, and he's in solitary confinement as well. His trial began on the 14th of April. He denied the charges. He faces the death penalty of life. There has been a moratorium on executions in South Korea since 1997. They've taken his phones. I mean, they've got everything they can on this guy in terms of proving his culpability. July 2025, that kind of brings us up to about 6 months ago. His request to be released from prison was denied by the Seoul District Court. He is still languishing in jail. At this stage, it's until the end of this year. And then I think they will probably, I'm not sure when the actual trial and verdict will be handed down, but that would be in the next few months, I would suggest. And we'll find out what happens to this character who basically off his own bat did something extreme. I don't know. He had faith in the military following his orders. They failed to do that. And yeah, civil society stood up and stopped this coup from actually taking place.
I'm not sure if because it's not your expertise, if you have an answer, but maybe you can.
I'll have a go, yeah.
Was everything that he did, was that constitutional? Was he actually in his right? Like,
That's
did you
right.
have the legal mandate to do that?
I think as a president, he has the ability. That's one of the things he can do. He can declare law. He can declare martial law. But then the legislative assembly has the ability to override that by voting on it. And he wanted to stop them from rejecting that martial law because he obviously didn't have control. They're from a different political party.
So, like a dirty card player trick. Have the people of South Korea digested what actually happened? Like, that's such an odd move.
Prior to his move, there were calls from a number of people across the political spectrum and even within the military. There was a lot of pressure on him to step down. So this was his last roll of the dice.
Okay.
And I think there's probably, again, it seems like with so many presidents who do things like this, that corruption allegations looming over him. So it was an attempt to try to mitigate or avoid that. Now he's obviously got himself in much hotter water.
Yeah. Some start a war or other external conflicts to distract, and he obviously
Actually,
tried to...
there's an interesting one. He ordered drones to drop propaganda leaflets over the northern border to try to instigate an incident, again, to distract from what was going on. That's another little story that's interesting. He didn't line his ducks up properly. He may have had an opportunity to do it if he had the military on site, etc. I think they're probably more sympathetic to the conservative side of politics in that country, but he didn't do that. And he obviously didn't have a solid base of support within his own party as well, because a lot of them dissented when he made this move. They were incredulous. They couldn't believe that he did it. So this is a person operating on his own almost.
David, it does sound like a desperate act of kind of self-preservation. What about the people, though? Was there any popular support for this guy's position?
None whatsoever, it seems. There were some hardliners within his party, old school hardliners, but very, very few. But in terms of the population at large, absolutely none whatsoever. I think even those who would consider themselves conservatives were outraged by his actions. So it's a bizarre outlier.
You mentioned he made a reference to North Korea as part of the reasoning why he's taken these actions. Or is there any evidence that that's actually there?
I think it's one of those things that South Korean politicians lean into when they're desperate, just like other politicians will have certain things that they like to bring up or signal towards in order to try to mobilize a base.
This is probably a fairly undignifying episode for him. Those around him, his supporters, I guess the people that put him in power in the first place, are they kind of shrinking into the background and avoiding this conveniently?
No, I think they're actually quite well insulated because it feels like this is something that he did almost. It shocked the people that were close to him as well. So yeah, you can say, where was this guy's head when he did this? Like, what was he actually thinking?
So
Everybody
maybe
was
not
shocked.
drugs, but definitely an aberration. Yeah.
It sounds like a real Hail Mary.
Yeah.
Like, why would you take such a drastic decision unless there was something else that you were really in trouble?
As happens with people in power, he really had no connection to the people, didn't understand the sentiment in the community, and maybe was under the illusion that what he was doing would be supported by the masses, and obviously completely misread his own population.
I think there's a lot to be said for that. But we were talking actually earlier prior to this episode about the number of self-coups that have taken place over the last 15 to 16 years when an incumbent tries to extend their power through potentially legal means and are rebuffed, or sometimes they're actually able to achieve it. So he might have looked at that kind of recent trend and thought, you know what, I've seen this happen around the world. I've seen enough people get away with it. Why not me? I'll give it a go. And he obviously had the confidence that it may have worked for him, but it didn't.
So do you reckon that he thought it was legal?
If the legislature hadn't voted, it would have been. He would have been able to. He could have continued to try to impose martial law, and he could have been continually rebuffed by the Legislative Assembly. And so that was, just simply his means of trying to override it.
Looking forward, so we've got a trial coming up in South Korea.
Yes, we do.
I think we should touch on this again. Hopefully we'll find a South Korean expert who can cover the trial for us, but also give us more context and insights. If there's any control mechanisms being put in place now after this, because clearly they don't want repetition of that, I assume, in South Korea. And maybe the lawyers have to do a bit of constitutional work.
I think the system actually worked because the Legislative Assembly was able to...
It sort of did, yeah, you're right.
It sort of
You're
did,
right.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you say, like, if the system works, and, like, why would you try it in the first place?
Well, let's hope the trial will uncover a lot of that, given that they have access, like you said, David, to all his private messages and everything that happened behind the scenes. So, historians will look at this and then try to find out what was going on in this man's mind. Thank you so much, David, for all your research, all your time.
Not a problem.
And you will be the co-host once a South Korean episode comes out.
Sounds good. Looking forward to it.
100%. Coming up, Madagascar, Guinea-Bissau. But let's quickly look at what happened in September in Nepal.
We begin this bulletin with the latest development that's happening in Nepal. The Gen Z protest has now escalated. The parliament has been burned down by the protesters today on the second day of the protest. The parliament building was seen set ablaze.
This is what the news sounded like in September when a parliament building and many, many other government buildings were literally on fire in Kathmandu, the capital of Nepal. And this is our second topic for today. My fellow Putschcasters, I've got some questions for you.
Go for it.
What is the Siliguri corridor? Have you ever heard of the Siliguri corridor?
I have not.
Hard no to that one.
So, you know the talk between NATO, I'm taking this somewhere else now, and Russia, and that little strip of land between Lithuania and Belarus, which is so crucial, that needs to be defended so the Baltic states don't get cut off.
Yeah.
There is another similar location like that in the southeast of Nepal, and it's called the Siliguri Corridor. Bangladesh sits at the south of it, Bhutan at the north, China sort of surrounds it, and Nepal is on one end, on the western end of the Siliguri Corridor. And I have to Google it or look it up again. It is not very wide. Okay, I don't have the exact kilometers or miles here, but it's not very wide. And it basically is crucial because one big part of India could be cut off immediately between Bangladesh and Nepal if they chose to.
By China.
Your speculation right
Okay.
there.
Well, who else is going to attack them?
And I've asked you this question to make listeners aware about the geopolitical context of this coup, uprising, revolution that just happened. Because Nepal is actually a lot more important than I ever thought. And also, like you, David, we should definitely do an episode on Nepal. Because even historically, there were 3 other coups that happened since the 50s. This is number 4 change of government involuntarily. Let's define it as that. And it is that rivalry, growing rivalry between China and India that makes Nepal such an important pawn in this chess game. Second question. Ready? Okay, you all failed on the first one, so this one can only get better.
Not necessarily.
Have you ever heard of the Bhutanese refugee scam? If not, I welcome you to speculate. What is the Bhutanese refugee scam?
I know those 3 words in isolation, but connected, no.
I can't even guess, but I'm saying there are some individuals who ostensibly came from Bhutan as refugees, but it was inauthentic.
No, I've got no idea.
So, Bhutan refugee scam. All right, there's your big word. There was an agreement in the United States of America that a certain number of refugees from Bhutan can resettle in the USA. Weird, eh? Considering it's the happiest country in the world. As many Western countries do, they have a certain quota and you can come in and settle as a refugee. Usually that's done almost through a lottery. Now, that actually was in place, but only until the late 2010s. And no one told people in Nepal that. So there was a scam where you could, as a Nepalese, pretend you from Bhutan, get a complete fake ID, fake background, name, and then go to the USA and be accepted, get a permanent visa as a refugee under this program. Very attractive for many people in Nepal because, as I will tell you in a second, living standards are not the highest. So you had to pay tens of thousands of US dollars to get the fake Bhutanese ID. And people thought that was the lottery ticket. They then got on a plane, flew to America and said, hello, here I'm a refugee. Here's all my documentation. I'm actually from Bhutan, which they're not. And you all signed up to have me here as a refugee. Plausible, right? Now, border guards at the US said, this program is no longer live. It doesn't exist. Sorry, can you please go back home? So they put them straight on the next plane and deported them. Do you know what the crazy thing about the scam is?
Who was running it?
Yes.
The Nepalese government?
Yes. We're not talking some prince from Nigeria who calls you. This is the Nepalese government running the scam on their own people. And why did I ask you this question? To give context on what level corruption is at, or at least until the coup in Nepal. And this led to various trials. It became public in 2023. And the actual Home Affairs Minister was arrested as well. To give you an idea of how rampant corruption is in Nepal. That's really important to understand this coup. Third question. You're not quite boomers yet, but you're all Gen Xers.
Not far off.
And you know my topic. My topic is Gen Z. And I've learned a lot about how young I'm not anymore. Do you know what a Nepo baby is? Have you heard of Nepo baby?
Yes.
Oh,
Yes,
finally.
I have heard of that one
yes.
as well, but I'm
I haven't. Okay.
Okay, so I'm going to make a sport reference here. Who knows LeBron James?
I do, yes.
I think I've heard of that guy.
Okay. I think Bronny James is his son. He's obviously grown up in a very privileged background and he's now playing for the Lakers, even though he's like 6'1" and considered not to be very good.
And he's obese as well, I guess.
No. I mean, he's a good basketball player. There's only so much... So far, being a Nepo baby will get you. It's like someone born into like a rich family that gets...
Like Brooklyn Beckham and his cooking YouTube channel and all of these things that he's indulged and allowed to kind of monetize, even though he has no discernible talent at anything that he does.
He has an excellent surname.
Yeah.
He's probably good looking, isn't he?
He is
Those
quite good
parents.
looking.
Yeah.
Sure.
And he
Sure.
also
That's a skill.
he did play for Brentford. Only the reserve side, and it was because of his name.
We just established what a Nepo baby is. For everyone who still hasn't caught on, it's short for nepotism.
Nothing to do with Nepal?
I did think of that. I thought it was like Nepal baby, but it's actually
Nepal baby.
Nepo baby, which then became Nepo kid, which became a hashtag. Yes, hashtags are still a thing even in 2025. Here the story starts. We have a government highly corrupt. Sorry about the cross promotion, but David, we just recently did an episode on Turkey, the chaos of the 1970s and the coup that followed by the military in 1980. This is copy-paste. When I started researching this topic, it was ridiculous how similar it was. For context, it used to be the only Hindu kingdom, right? Nepal used to be a Hindu kingdom until 2008. So the republic is still quite young if you think about it. However, ever since it became a republic, there has been about a musical chair feel around the most important offices in the land, which basically was three very old men constantly changing the guard. And when you break it down, you land at about a government per year, almost Italian sort of circumstances where no government actually gets anything done because by the time they get started, the next one starts, which is again what we had in Turkey, right? This constant left, right, center. But we're not talking left, right here. One party is actually called Leninist, Marxist, I'm getting this wrong, party. The other one is a breakaway party from that, which is a Maoist party. And then there's a third one. But none of them are really communist either. It's bizarre, I think, just by name. So we've now had 16, 17 years of this system where either candidate A, B, or C is in power. Candidate A starts a program, new bridge, new highway, whatever. Candidate B takes over, puts it on hold. Unless he gets a bribe, he doesn't continue it. But it's the whole, you scratch my back, I scratch yours. There's a clear agreement there. And here, the figure is really interesting. So this is all men in their 70s, really old people. And this is really what I've learned about this coup, revolution, whatever it is a generational divide. It's definitely a generational conflict because what Nepal has in excess is young people. Exactly what Western countries don't have. It's the opposite. The average Nepalese person is 25 years old. I think in most Western countries we're talking early 40s.
It's like 39 or something like that.
Late 30s, early 40s. It's a developing country with many, many financial struggles. So just to give you another figure, in US dollars, the average income is $1,400 a year, not per month. And that's not much anywhere in the world. And now, again, another parallel to our Turkey episode, which is when it comes to remittances. Does everyone know what a remittance is? So, and we talked about this. Turkey is very much like that, where you've got this large diaspora. A lot of people left the country to seek better futures elsewhere. And then the government becomes dependent on those people sending money back to their home country. And when we actually talked about that, our expert, I'm not sure if it was on the record or after the recording, he actually made the comparison to Nepal. He said Turkey back then was like what Nepal is now. There is a huge diaspora of Nepalese people. And yes, some of them are in Western countries. They come as international students, workers. However, a lot of them are in the Gulf states. Correct, in the Middle East. So, you know, all those fancy skyscrapers popping up, those people living in slave-like conditions, a lot of them are from Nepal. And they're obviously there, not because they enjoy it, but because they have to.
Qatari stadiums as well for the World Cup.
Exactly.
Recently.
There was also a horrible story that popped up this year about Nepalese fighting in Ukraine against Ukrainians. I'm not sure if you heard about that. Everyone heard about the North Koreans.
Yeah, the North
fighting.
Koreans. Yeah.
But there was also young Nepalese men fighting there, and they didn't even know what they're there for. They just signed up for something. They're just so desperate for money. So we've got this large population abroad. Most of them are not there because they want to. They obviously love their home country, but they have to for financial reasons. Income is very low. Population is extremely young.
And it's small, right? It's kind of like 30 million. Yeah?
30 million. So
it's not a big place.
It's by Asian standards on the lower end.
It's pretty small.
But obviously, as we know, it's Himalayas. So there's, I think, very limited space people can actually live unless you live on a mountaintop, which wouldn't be that comfortable. And then there's a very high unemployment rate of about 13%, and that's on average. So the youth unemployment is huge. Young people have to leave to make a living. And back to the good old question about the Nepo baby, why I brought that one up. Because remember, Dave, in the old days before the internet, when either journalists had to uncover stories of waste and wealth and decadence? Now we reached a stage where you don't have to search for that because people openly brag about it because that's a social media culture. So that we all know those, influencers in Dubai driving the Ferraris and blah, blah. I don't know. People find it interesting. I find it utterly boring, but, a shopping trip in Paris, that sort of stuff, right? And in the Western world, We don't think it's clever, but some people seem to like it. However,
Could mention the name Kardashian.
lots of copycats in developing countries, such as Nepal. Now, that's probably fair enough if you're a self-made millionaire. The problem is here, people doing that are the kids and grandkids of those 70-plus-year-old politicians who have been in power forever, have done nothing good for the country, and their kids aren't very smart posting this, get a huge following, but then the tide turned.
Putschcast, a global podcast about riots, rebellions, revolutions, and the intoxication of power.
Kleptocracies. The state sounds like it's geared towards those in power enriching themselves on the backs of everybody else that lives there.
And this is why I shared that example before of that visa scam, where normally you think it's run from some call center, dodgy mafia-associated sort of group. This is government doing that. And so here's your 3 points. So we've got a young generation that can't make ends meet, disillusioned. They see corruption everywhere all day. And you've got other young people who happen to be winners of the sperm lottery, i.e. Papa is someone important, and they're rubbing it in how wealthy they are. And there's one example that's often quoted, which I'll also quote, which is one of the, I think, sons or so built a Christmas tree. I'm sure it's not a Nepalese tradition, out of Louis Vuitton boxes or something like that, right? Just to show how much he purchased that year. It's a story about inequality, which we also face in the West. But I think it's a lot harsher when you have living circumstances like that. And you see this as people that shouldn't be earning that much more, i.e. they've also never done anything in their lives, but they're bragging about it and being celebrated for wasting your resources. That is the context of this event. However, getting to the story, a government, and I saw some of the reports and the obviously translations from the laws, but they came up with that smart idea of banning social media outright. Why? Because some influencers, not Nepo babies, but normal young influencers in Nepal, questioned and put those people on display and created reaction videos, which are huge, right? This young guy posts his Louis Vuitton Christmas tree, and then this young girl does a reaction video. It's like, this is nuts. This is insane. Where are we living here? You know, my parents don't know how to pay rent, and here's this government son who does this. That went viral. Millions and millions of shares, and many other videos did too. Conservative government, even though they claim to be extremely left-wing, what can old men think of? Let's just ban it, right? So that's the idea. Let's just ban it, problem solved, right? So the idea is, let's ban social media for everyone. Now, it is the 21st century, and Nepal is advanced when it comes to that because social media has a certain position in especially countries where there is no conventional media as we know it in the West. Like, this is a new way of communicating. And I'm talking WhatsApp and other apps as well. So I'm not talking just your Facebook. This is almost every app you have on your phone banned. There's no vote on this by Parliament. It's just the government, I think the Minister of Communications, coming up with this law. And they've tried it before, but this time they're like, okay, this is the solution to our problem. There's too much dissent out there. Let's just shut down all the channels. However, I've just told you that so many Nepalese live abroad. This basically meant millions of people cut off from their families. And to give you another figure that is eye-watering, almost a third of the whole GDP of Nepal comes from remittances. So the government is extremely dependent on that money flowing back. However, imagine your son, daughter, brother, cousin is in another country. You talk every night on a screen, and all of a sudden none of this exists. And this went as far as a calendar app, which is a simple, you type in your date and it tells you what date it is, because the Nepalese have a very different calendar to the one we use. And that's all it does. And even that was banned, right, under that law. So what happened is government comes up with this idea. Lots of Nepo baby hashtags before. That went viral. That became a movement. Young people clearly don't agree. And they basically organized those gatherings and protests. First in Kathmandu, and then it spread around the country. But what's interesting about that is it's a leaderless uprising or rebellion or whatever. That's the fascinating thing about it, where in South Korea, what you just said, David, you can clearly pinpoint it on one man, and that was his idea. And the other coups I think we hear about also. This one I found fascinating because there's not one protagonist, there's not one leader, there's no party. It's literally, and that's similar to the Arab Spring, it's a couple of teenagers on whatever channel. The government, again, notice they're trying to push this through on the 4th of September this year, 2025, in order to shut down. However, silly as they were, it was leading up to it. So the young people had about 5 days to get organized on social media to protest this. If they would have just shut it down overnight, they would have woken up in the morning with no social media. It would have been a lot harder to organize, but silly mistake there. And then comes the 8th of September, which was a Monday. They now call it Bloody Monday. It was a peaceful protest, and I watched some footage on YouTube as well. They're literally sitting around, almost like hippie sort of feel, anti-Vietnam War sort of protest. When you think of that, get your guitar with you and making signs, and they just gather. The government decides to crack down. And I think we've seen this in history many times, where not the actual protest is the issue, but the way the government responds. And then it becomes its own beast. And this is exactly what happened. So the government cracked down. So they started off with rubber bullets, but apparently live ammunition was used, which is also apparently not legal, even in Nepal. 19 people died, hundreds of people injured. And there was also a victim that was as young as 12, just to give you an idea of the people. Hence the Gen Z, which I think is defined as people between 13 and 30 at the moment. And so the hospitals were flooded with those victims. It was completely unnecessary, heavy crackdown. And then the next day, this thing got completely out of control. And then this is when you turned on your TVs and you saw all those buildings on fire, smoke all over Kathmandu. It is really, the damage is horrific. So this whole movement just exploded. Obviously, more people joined. People with bad intentions too. There was looting all over the place. And it went as far as chasing government officials to their private houses. So private homes were torched, Parliament building, I think even the High Court, almost every government building you can think of got damaged in some way, and some got completely ruined. This all happened within 24 to 48 hours. And this was not that foreseeable if it wasn't for that violent reaction by the government.
What was the position of the military after the first day, where obviously that overreaction took place? Were they stood down?
The government is gone. The military steps in because there was no one else. There was literally no one else left. The government was gone. And there was one minister who was hiding in a river or in a lake or something that dragged him out. Like, it's the most weird stories. There's so much stuff on social media. You can see of what happened there. And yeah, there was a lot of humor as well. There was a lot of memes created around that. Basically everything the government was trying to ban just, popped up. And obviously now the whole world was watching, as you all remember. So then what happened? The government was gone. Military comes in. It's like, as you always do, curfew, let's calm things down, soldiers on the streets, stop torching buildings. And it worked. And now it gets really bizarre. In most countries, unfortunately, military then decides to stay in power, right? And then they come up with some sort of excuse where it takes 4 or 5 years for the next election, and the top general happens to be the interim president, which then becomes president for life. And, we've seen the story many times before. Not in this case. In Nepal, they're trying to do this in 6 months. The uprising was in September. A new election will be happening in March if everything goes according to plan. So they're questioning the whole constitution now as well, because clearly the political system did not work. It was just a bunch of old people running the whole place. And I don't think you can do that when you have an average population of 25 and everyone in charge is in their 70s. The disconnect's just too huge, which we've seen when they're trying to ban social media, clearly not understanding what that means for young people. That's just so disconnected from real life. However, military's in charge. And then they're like, what are we doing now? Back to the young people. So then they started online, because the services were still up or back up, about who should run this country in the interim. And they voted for the new person in charge. Her name is Sushila Karki. She's also the first ever female leader of Nepal. So this is another outcome of this coup. Do you know how she was voted in as interim?
I'm going to say a poll.
A raffle.
Instagram?
WhatsApp, social media.
On a Discord channel.
Yeah, okay. Then.
So on Discord, which is, if you're a gamer, you'd know it. On Discord, 150,000 Nepalese, majority of them young, got on there and then decided who the next leader will be, who will take the country back to a new democratic pathway.
You're talking about a country which has been ruled by a merry-go-round of septuagenarians handing power to one another. Were they legitimately elected, or did they rig everything every single time?
No, they were legitimately elected.
Because they were the only options.
Correct. And there was just no choice.
Who's this woman connected to then?
She is a lawyer by trade. So she was like one of the highest justices in the Nepalese system, knows the constitution inside out. And this is where it gets interesting. She's one of the few people who, throughout her whole career, fought corruption. So in the end, back to my story from the start, it is all about corruption. So when you think of why did this protest happen? Real corruption and, again, rubbing in wealth and waste.
So her election was enabled by
The military.
the previous structure basically collapsing and the military saying, we are going to
What do we do
rubber stamp
now? And the military stepped out immediately, which is very rare. So the military is like, okay, let's calm it down. Let's make sure we have a way forward. We need someone in charge. Who's that going to be? People get together on Discord and then decide about this new leader, former lawyer, Justice Sushila Kaki. And it's her job now to make sure that a fair election is held in March. And the interesting part about this is she's a judge, obviously. She's in her 70s as well. So how ironic is this, that the whole revolt was against, the rule of the old, and they've selected someone like her, which shows a form of humility, I guess, and realism on the side of the young people. However, I think it's all about integrity as well, because she is one of the few integer people in the Nepalese system, it seems, that they trust. She's outside of the political sphere. She's not connected to any of the parties that were in charge until now. And she has fought corruption her whole life.
Will she run in the elections?
I've asked myself that very same question.
Does she have a political party?
I don't think she does. But
How can you be Prime
I think
Minister?
I think they're craving an independent. I'm not sure after all that happened.
So I suppose we can hypothesize and say that the military step back. They've allowed this woman to take power nominally for a bit before elections just to cool tensions. I feel like if the military had said we're going to maintain power and form a new regime, military-based regime, the wrath of the young people would have continued and potentially exacerbated. So this is a way of actually trying to return to business as usual, and they may choose it when the elections do not go the way that they want to go, okay, now we're actually going to
Maybe.
put our foot down.
There was no protests from the other side, which you usually have, right? Like people were actually supportive of what the young people were doing. Because again, the majority of people are young people. And
Have the 70-year-olds fled the country? Have the Nepo babies and the 70-year-old left?
I think most of them would, because they were fearing for their lives. Like there were some real brutal scenes. People got injured, like a minister and his wife got injured when the house got burned.
They'll all have Swiss bank accounts now.
Yes.
I'm sure they do. They probably have dual citizenship as well.
But you sound like pretty optimistic about this. Like from what you're saying, this new person, you're saying like she doesn't belong to a political party. She's got no connection to the military. But seemingly the military have pulled back and now she's the one that's in charge. So she's like, they're not doing anything. It sounds to me like it's just going to be rearranging the chairs on the Titanic as it goes down.
Then the whole uprising would have been in vain and failed. But I think people in Nepal right now are still very hopeful. Because again, this whole republic idea is fairly new. It's fairly young and obviously didn't work well for the last 15 years. But who knows who they vote in next year. And I do think that requires another episode.
And when are the elections?
In March. So I'm making a commitment here to our listeners right now that we will revisit this coup with an actual expert and then see how the election goes, see what happens. Maybe there's another uprising, who knows? It might also hopefully go very peaceful and this country might prosper in future.
Like the next time that this is revisited, do you have a prediction? What do you think? Because you do sound really optimistic about it.
No, my biggest fear is around the lack, and this is what I've learned from other episodes, the lack of political maturity and the infrastructure not being in place of established, trustworthy, integer political leaders who actually do put the country first. If the same old guard runs again, maybe they put a new face on the poster to advertise their party, but it's the same old with.
It sounds like a lot like this woman sounds like just a new face on the old system.
No, she's completely removed from the old process. And that's the refreshing moment here for the country.
It seems a bit too good to be true to me.
Yes,
It feels like a very unmilitary decision.
I know.
And
I can't believe it either.
the points that you were making at the start regarding whatever the name of the passage was, surely outside interests would be playing a role and stirring the pot here, right?
It is that conflict of interest between China and India. But again, countries in the past some have played it well. They have played major powers against each other and then benefited from it. And maybe Nepal needs a government like that, where there is clear conflict between India and China arising, and Nepal is sort of caught in the middle. But maybe they can benefit from it. Who knows?
Well, I'm actually going to throw out, Dave, what do you think is going to happen?
I think irrespective of whether the military allow her to, she wins an election and she is allowed to continue, you cannot unpick that culture of corruption, which is so deep-rooted, unless you completely remove the civil service and find people to replace them, which I don't think is viable. So I think she'll be undermined, find it very difficult, and there'll be, at some point next year, there'll be another spasm of potentially violence or political upheaval, and something else will emerge. It might be the old guard coming back, or it might be a military takeover, but I don't think she's going to make it.
Yeah,
I'm with you, David. I don't think this one's dead yet. I think under-the-table influences from neighbouring nations will have their say.
Yeah. I'm with you guys. I think it's complete bullshit. Like, we've seen this so many times before, and it's funny that you mentioned the Arab Spring.
Yeah.
I mean, like,
we all know how that ended, yeah?
How has that ended? Like, why is this going to be any different? They went from a monarchy to a republic. The military wouldn't allow this to happen at the end of the day if they didn't know what the end result was going to be. And it's going to be the same. It's going to be the same elites in the same places, and nothing's going to change.
I am making this commitment. We're trying to find an expert. If you know someone, let us know. Putschcast@gmail.com. If not, we'll find a real expert who can unpick this a bit more, has more context for us. And then also we will definitely follow that election if it happens. Let's see. I think it's very ambitious. That's what I said, to do it in such a short time. But time to move on. And I've just mentioned that maybe some of the people high up in Nepal happen to have dual citizenship, so they can just go to another country if they need to, because I know our next event has exactly that story at the center of it.
Now let's go to the Indian Ocean country of Madagascar, where the president's office says a, quote, violent attempt to seize power is underway. And now an elite unit of Madagascar's army has claimed control of all military forces. The special unit is known as CAPSAT and joined anti-government protests just yesterday. It called on other security forces to follow them.
That was a news headline back in October 2025. Yes, you're still with us here on Putschcast. We're reviewing the last year. We picked out 4 different conflicts, events, uprisings, coups, putsches, whatever you want to call them. We started off with South Korea, then went to Nepal, and now we're in Madagascar. And I'm happy to have my co-Putschcaster, we just renamed him from Dave to Sloaney, on the mic now. Dave, over to you. Madagascar, what the hell happened there?
Yeah, thanks, Oliver. We're talking about what happened in Madagascar only a couple of months ago. The president, Andry Rajoelina, was displaced by a military coup. When I put my hand up for this topic, I thought there's a lot of interesting context here because I really don't understand a lot about Madagascar. It's a bit of a blind spot for me, and I'm going to learn a little bit along the way. Between the time that I thought, hang on a second, I need to learn about Madagascar, and now I have spoken to quite a few people, and it seems I'm not alone in that boat. So people want to know what goes on in Madagascar. They've seen the Disney movie, and that's about as far as people's understanding goes. Madagascar is an island, part of Africa, southern Africa, and it's just off the east coast. A very large island. I think, Oliver, you mentioned it a little bit earlier when we were talking about Nepal. It's the 4th largest island in the world. By land size, it's pretty big, right? It's bigger than Spain, it's bigger than France, but we've got a population of about 30 million people. Historically, really interesting place. So its geographical position has lent a lot to the way that, I guess, society and politics has panned out in Madagascar. It has been a trade route. So if you think about the way that ships used to move around the world, a lot of them traveling between Europe and Asia would have to go around the bottom of Africa before the Suez Canal existed. And a lot of those ships stopped in Madagascar. So there's been influence from all of the European powers over the course of time. Most recently, it has been France, and I think France has left the most lasting legacy, and that still definitely exists today. Madagascar gained independence from France in 1960. So that brings us to where we are now. Politics this year, absolutely fascinating stuff. So Andry Rajoelina, and you'll have to forgive me, there's some really complicated surnames and place names in Madagascar, and I'll hopefully weave my way around them. Andry Rajoelina had been in power on and off since 2009. Now, in October this year, the situation in Madagascar became particularly inflamed. Democracy has broken down to a point where the institutional structures are ineffective. So the population is feeling that they're not being served at all by the government or the judiciary or the legislature. We've got a situation where it's a fairly young population. It's a very poor population. I think if you look at the United Nations Human Development Index, we're basically in the bottom 10 in the world, right? We're right down there. People don't have a lot of money. It's kind of rural subsistence style living. Electricity starts falling apart. Water stops. And the Generation Z basically are the ones that pick up the mantle and start making a lot of noise. Now, this has been boiling for a while. So over the last couple of months leading up to the 15th of October, protests are growing and growing. I will talk a little bit later on about the setting for this, though, because the real dysfunction really set in 2023. And there was a bit of a sham election that took place that put Rajoelina back into power. No one's been satisfied since that point in time. We've got a Generation Z getting themselves organised. They're taking to the streets. They're protesting. And I'll take a little tangent here because I find this really particularly interesting. And there's a connection to Nepal, which we just talked about earlier in this particular cast. And I'll ask my fellow podcasters this question. Who's heard of the One Piece movement?
No idea.
No, I've not heard of it.
Are we showing our age again? Is it a Gen Z question?
It is definitely a Gen Z question. And if I didn't have a teenage daughter, I certainly wouldn't know about it myself. But One Piece in itself is a Japanese manga sort of series, cartoon. It has been typified by these kind of cheeky, rebellious, treasure-hunting teenagers who have sort of magic powers, right? I've noticed the One Piece flag, which is a skull and crossbone, wearing a straw hat, right? It's fairly distinctive, popping up in a lot of the vision of protests in Madagascar as well as in Nepal. And I did a little bit of digging into it. It actually kicked off in Indonesia and has popped up as well in Sri Lanka and in France. And basically, it is a movement which is about protesting situations where democracy is not doing its job. And the teens, Gen Zs, are disenfranchised by the whole situation, where corruption is rife. And picking up the mantle kind of globally, I guess, to carry this movement and hopefully make a change in the country that they're in. Now, this emerged in October in Madagascar. Yeah, so we've got a little bit of international, I guess, energy and inspiration for what's going on here. But as I said, it does date back years and years and years. And really from 2009 when Andry Rajoelina came into power, it's almost as if this situation was inevitable. But let's just talk through the situation and exactly what took place in the middle of October. So protests are taking place. They're growing day by day. Kids are taking to the streets. Now, on October the 11th, there's a warning which comes from the military. So there's a specialist kind of military unit called CAPSAT, which is an acronym. They stood up and they announced that they were siding with the protesters. They're not happy with the way that the government's doing its job, and they're going to support the protesters and make sure that they're safe. October the 13th, Andry Rajoelina starts to get a little bit worried. There are reasons why this is happening, because he's seen this before. And funnily enough, he was the protagonist in 2009 of a very similar coup. And he was the one who was supported by the military as a protester against the sitting government. And it basically was the action that brought him into power. CAPSAT at that time took the side of Andry Rajoelina. There was a military coup and Andry was installed as an interim president. Roll the clock forward to the 11th of October in 2025. And we've got CAPSAT saying they're siding with the student and Gen Z protesters, basically pushing Andry Rajoelina out. He sees the writing on the wall and he flees. So as far as coups go, this is like relatively bloodless. There is a bit of sort of military action early in the protests, and I think there are a number of people that lost their lives. It's riotous, but not extremely inflated.
CAPSAT have popped up a few times and they sound like kingmakers in terms of who's ruling Madagascar. Like, how big is this unit and what position do they kind of have in terms of the military universe in Madagascar?
And where they're sort of the Praetorian Guard, but they didn't do their job.
They definitely do stand out and come up from time to time. I think what's really interesting, in 2009, when these guys stood up and got behind Andry Rajoelina to bring him into power, it was described at the time as a mutiny. So they didn't necessarily have the rest of the military on their side. The Navy went in completely the other direction and were sort of really upset with the situation and were defending the in-place government. But Capsat seemed to have the trump card when it counts. They installed him at that time.
And then they dropped him like a hot potato.
They certainly did. But that took quite a time for those wheels to turn. One of the things that's said about Andry Rajoelina and the way that he ran things is he had created sort of an institutional coup where the major government institutions, and this is a self-coup of sorts, so the major government institutions were basically stacked in his favour. And that definitely helped him stay in power for as long as he did. What's happened with Andry Rajoelina is the Capsat guys have got involved and they've said, okay, we're supporting the protesters. He gets on a plane and takes off. People don't actually know where he is. Rumour is that the plane that he got on was a French military transport. He broadcast via Facebook that he has fled and he is sheltering because his life has been threatened.
Aty amin'ny continent afrikanina hoe andefa andeha tafika izay apandry ny tany dia niteneniko hoe tsy mifanaraka amin'ny fotom-pisainana malagasy izany andefa andeha tafika zany ka nilaviko.
What happened on October the 14th is, again, remotely. Andry gets involved. He gets onto Facebook and he announces that he's dissolving the National Assembly. That's basically flatly ignored, and the Parliament votes for impeachment. October the 15th enrolls the military, and Colonel Randrianarina is the one who takes power. He dissolves the constitution, he dissolves the upper house, and they undertake to put in place a 2-year transitional government. Without a whimper, really, Andry Rajoelina has been pushed out of government. I think that's because he saw the writing on the wall, because he's become the victim of the sorts of action that he undertook in 2009. He's come in via the military. He stood aside, put one of his mates in place, and then 5 years later, he's been voted democratically back as the president. Now, 2023, things get really, really interesting because for someone from Madagascar to have a foreign passport and retain their Madagascan citizenship is illegal. Andry Rajoelina goes and gets himself French citizenship, right? So he's got a French passport. The world knows about this and everybody in Madagascar knows about this. So the election that's going ahead in 2023, 10 of the candidates that are standing against him basically refuse to campaign. So they stand aside. This is a sham election. This can't happen. This guy cannot stand for president. The election goes ahead in any case. I guess the voter turnout is really, really low. I think they're down to 47% or something to that effect. When Rajoelina came to power, something like 60% is what the voter turnout was, and that probably gives you an idea of the disenchantment, I guess, with the democratic system. Everybody stands down expecting the right thing to happen from a judiciary point of view, and for Rajoelina to not be allowed to take power. But he really has he's stacked the cards in his favour, and the Constitutional High Court, 2 weeks after the election, announces that it's valid and that he should be the president. There he is. He's in power. Nobody wants him there. The place is falling apart in the meantime. Like there's been real problems with this government. Foreign investment has fled the country. The situation with sort of poverty and inequality is just getting stronger and stronger and stronger. The youth of Madagascar, as is usually the case, are the ones who are mobilised and who are starting to make some noise about it. It's their future that's on the line. From that 2023 election onwards, it starts to bubble and really gets louder and louder until we get to October 2025 when these events took place.
So I'm wondering, the president flees with his French passport. Does he empty the treasury on his way out the door?
I don't know. There's not a lot said for the economics of this situation.
If there was anything to take.
Yeah. There's not a lot there to start with. So I think one of the challenges in Madagascar is one of those battles that's probably typical of developing nations like this, where in order to industrialise, they need to invite huge foreign investment. That's the way they make it happen. Now, the foreign investment comes into the country, but it also leaves, right? The profits go overseas. And there's a small kind of minority elite that are the ones that are able to facilitate this investment, and they're the ones who win. Rajoelina is definitely one of those guys.
So Rajoelina, who shouldn't have run to begin with because it's treason to have another citizenship, let alone run as head of state. And then Colonel Randrianarina, was he the head of that military unit that you talked about earlier?
He was.
Coincidentally, yes. Of course.
Yeah, of course.
So he is
president.
Now, as we speak, at the end of the year, he's now the president.
Correct.
By his own grace.
And he will likely stay that way for the next 2 years if he has his way.
Because unlike Nepal, they're not ambitious, who try to do it in 6 months. They are trying to do it in 2 years and see what comes.
It's really interesting because the military was almost invited by the constitutional judiciary to take power. That's more or less what I've reading between the lines.
Similar to Nepal again, because there was no one else left.
But there were conditions there, like it was expected that in a short time frame that they would put it back to the public and allow an election to take happen.
Define short.
Yeah, exactly. One of the quotes that I did pick up, the African Union, they published this paper, the African Union Peace and Security Council. This one's pretty interesting. It says, what began as a convergence of interests between CAPSAT and the youth-led movement has given way to a troubling divergence between the protesters' demands for genuine democratic renewal and the military's consolidation of its own authority. Right. So they've put themselves in there with the support of the people, but they've not really given the people what they were asking for.
Just to confirm, Sloane, the old president fled the country. He shouldn't have been there to begin with. First of all, he, didn't obey by his own laws with the dual citizenship, but also it was a sham election how he got there.
Correct, yeah.
And here's my question. So United Nations, I remember that on the news as well, came out, as they do, and condemning the military takeover. This shouldn't happen, this is against international law, etc. Now, why would you do that against someone who shouldn't have been there to begin with? What's the point?
There is some real complexity in what's going on here. Now, I've got to admit, I've read as much as I can in a short space of time, but far out, there are some layers that I do not understand. That certainly is one of them, and it's not just the United Nations, it's the African Union as well as the Southern African Development Community.
So, Dave, we've got a colonel who's now president.
He is, yeah, and staying there for at least a couple of years by the sounds of it.
Do we have any feedback on sentiment? How did the population respond? How did the protesters who kicked this off initially respond to this? Is that what they wanted?
I think the sentiment is positive, and I think there's actually two sides too. So that quote that I just read from the African Union, I think there's two sides to this, right? On one hand, there's the African Union position that these guys said that they would go back to the people and there would be a general election within 60 days, and they've broken that promise. On the other hand, I think there's a feeling that I'm getting is that democracy and the political institutions in Madagascar are so broken that it's expected that it will take 2 years, and there's like a 6-step plan, more or less, to rewire the whole system and start it again. It has been a situation, certainly since 2009, that it's been mostly broken, and there's been a little bit of hope from time to time. But yeah, it really hasn't helped the country go forward. So yeah, David.
Are we talking broken in terms of endemic corruption like Nepal, or just systems that don't work and a bureaucracy that simply doesn't function or have the skill set to assist in the development of a country or like do their jobs?
Yeah, look, I think corruption's definitely a part of it, and the systems are failing as a consequence because the institutions are more or less tainted by that corruption.
So like self-enrichment is still a big part of how everything works. And I do have a question about tourism and how much money that puts into the Madagascan economy. I know they have a lot, like you said, it's in many instances quite pristine in terms of its natural resources. And when you take the guidelines or the guardrails away from exploiting those, that can have a significant impact. Do you know how much tourism contributes to their economy?
It is definitely a large contributor, or was. And again, and this is probably a fact check point, but after the 2009 coup, which installed Rajoelina, tourism dropped by something like 60%, and all but one of, I guess, the international hotels in the capital shut down. That's a sort of impact that this activity is having, and you can see why the population's been really pissed off.
There's a common denominator again. Same thing in Nepal. We talked about the remittances. The other big income is obviously tourism because the Himalayas, and here it's the rainforest. I also want to acknowledge that this is the third coup we talked about where the military takeover is viewed as something positive. We had it in Turkey in 1980. We had it in Nepal this year. But again, they handed over power immediately within weeks, really. And now we've got this one where, as far as we can tell, the population actually agrees with what just happened.
My understanding, yeah, the 2025 coup, the military intervention, certainly perceived as positive. In 2009, much more contentious. I think the nation was much more divided at that time. They didn't know what they were getting with Rajoelina. He was kind of a charismatic and popular fellow, but a bit of an unknown quantity.
Putschcast, a global podcast about riots, rebellions, revolutions, and the intoxication of power.
Here we are. We've just learned about a coup that got a lot of attention, I have to say. I was quite impressed how the Western media picked up on Madagascar. And we are staying on the continent, moving to the opposite side of the continent to learn more about what happened in Guinea-Bissau.
Right now, a coup has been confirmed in Guinea-Bissau. Now, earlier today, we heard heavy gunfire outside the presidential palace, just days after general elections took place. Let's have a listen to that.
That was a news story about what just happened in Guinea-Bissau. But as just mentioned, Nepal was widely covered, South Korea anyway. So was Madagascar. The one that you picked, James, didn't get much coverage, did it?
Well, and I think there might be a reason for that. Is because no one knows about it or where it is or about anything to do with Guinea-Bissau. But it is kind of interesting. When I researched it, I looked through Reuters and The Economist and even ChatGPT. I know I'm not supposed to, but it is part of the Portuguese-speaking world. So I'm just going to give you a bit of a background to it. The Portuguese, according to The Economist, were actually there for about 500 years, but the interior wasn't affected by them for about 400 years. But then after that, it became part of the Portuguese Empire, and it fell in 1974, which I believe was a coup in Portugal.
Correct.
Carnation Revolution
Correct.
In Portugal was kind of the instigating factor for a lot of the colonies.
And to just single out that this were one of the last colonies in Africa. Like we're talking, 13, 14 years after the year of freedom.
And that was one of the interesting things I found about, and that's, I mean, not just about Portugal, but the Portuguese-speaking world. I think Brazil was like one of the last places in the Western world to abolish slavery, which was like 1890. Mm-hmm. And this was a Portuguese colony until about 1974. The feeling that I get from it was a fairly neglected one. Like Angola and Mozambique apparently had taken a lot more of the infrastructure of the Portuguese in terms of like the language, in terms of like forms of governance and stuff like that. To give you an idea of Guinea-Bissau, its main export is cashew nuts.
I love them.
Yeah, I think they're quite nice, actually. I've had them a few times. But they're probably from Guinea-Bissau, so there you go. But their other main export, which you probably don't want to talk about if you've taken them, is cocaine. So it was, I'm not saying you, Dave, but Sloaney, sorry.
So it's not all on South America.
It's not, no, so...
Because I hear cocaine and I think of South America, but obviously not.
Sorry, I should caveat that. They don't produce cocaine because of their location in the world. They are a main sort of like middleman between South America and Europe. One of the things I read in Reuters is it's not uncommon to see Colombians driving around in souped-up cars.
In Guinea-Bissau?
In Guinea-Bissau,
okay.
Yeah. So there you go.
So they don't grow the coca. It's just the point at which it comes off the boats and then it's repackaged and
pretty much,
heads to Europe.
And one of the things that I read was because the institutions are so terrible there, one of the main things that I found fascinating about this place is it's so undeveloped, they're not even sure how many people are in this country. So they reckon it's between 2 and about 2.2 million. Official statistics aren't readily available. I'm going to give you some years here. So I was born in 1980, there was one there. Between 1982 and 85, there was one. Between 98 and 99, there was a civil war. 2003, they removed the president. 2010, there was military unrest. 2012, there was a military coup. 2022, there was a failed coup attempt, which brings us to 2025.
Which also answers my initial question of why this one didn't make the news. Because if coups occur that frequently, it's no news story anymore. It's just annual occurrence, almost. It's exaggerated. But that really explains, well, in a place like Korea, obviously we have interest as well, but Korea, it is a big news story. Even Nepal, where they had stability, and even in Madagascar was some form of stability. Guinea-Bissau seems to be very fragile state.
So I am reading out a quote from The Economist here about Guinea-Bissau. And it says, the persistence of coups reflects a convergence of structural factors, including a politicized military, weak civilian oversight, economic fragility, and the availability of illicit revenue streams, which brings us up to 2025. So the current president, who has just been removed, named President Umaro Embaló. He's actually suspended Parliament on 2 occasions in 22 and 23. So he's probably not a beacon of democratic, thought, I'm guessing. What led to this was that there was an election between this particular gentleman, Embaló, and a guy called Diaz. The military said that there was irregularities in the voting, and they have decided to take over. As a consequence, there is a transitional period now of 12 months, and the military will hold elections after this 12 months period. They haven't actually appointed a transitional candidate yet, but this is going to happen after. As I mentioned earlier, the main exports are cashews and cocaine. It was named by the UN, I think it was back in about 1992, I can be fact-checked, as the first African narco-state, which is quite interesting as well. And I bring that up purely because they believe, or I have read, that the changes in leadership are actually more to do with protecting the profits of the cocaine as opposed to the governance of the country.
Fascinating topic. Dave, just from your reference to Madagascar before, I was asking myself that very question: when does a state become a failed state? Because I think Madagascar was is very close to that from what you've shared. But now what you just said, James, that they're clearly not the interests of the nation at heart here. This is all on behalf of someone else, whoever that is in the background.
Everything that I have read and everything points to this place being a failed state.
It sounds like the whole place is just a fence for Colombian drug lords.
Pretty much. Also, another interesting statistic is that I read that they're actually hardly any richer now in 2024 than they were in 1974 when the Portuguese left.
Illegitimate income, so...
Yeah, what you can put on the books.
I wonder what their crypto balance looks like.
It makes it a perfect place for it, James. Simply the location. It's pretty much the closest place to Brazil or South America. When you look at the map across the Atlantic, it's the first sort of port you hit, which is probably why the Portuguese chose it to begin with. But then also the whole idea that it's a small place. You said 2 million people. Like, you couldn't do this with a gigantic country. 2 million people. That's basically a mid-sized European city, and the military seems to be in charge consistently. Was there a period when there was because you just used the term before that I really liked, that I want to think about too, politicized military, you said. Yeah. Was there a period when there wasn't a military government? No. Or?
And one may ask, why does a country like Guinea-Bissau even need a military in the first place? It's not like they've got to defend themselves from any opponents. Pretty much the entire history of the Guinea-Bissau seems to be one coup after another. And 2025,
one general ousting another one.
Pretty much. Like if the military come in and they're obviously corrupt, I mean, obviously they're there to like protect the profits from, the drug trade. As you can guarantee that the person that they're going to put in is going to continue that sort of protection racket.
James, in your research, has there been a successful, meaningful election?
So there doesn't look like there has been many elections that have actually been successful. The military seem to force a coup literally every other year. It doesn't seem to be a place where there is much in the way of democracy. It definitely seems to be a veneer of it, though.
I was going to say, no one here seems to be fooling themselves that it's a democratic state.
No, it's definitely not a democratic state.
So, James, you just gave us a good idea. Democracy has never really flourished since independence from Portugal. The military seems to outdo themselves with toppling one government after another, even though mainly they're involved in it. What was the regional response to that?
So the African Union has criticised Guinea-Bissau over the unconstitutional change of government, but they haven't said much else after that. The United Nations have urged dialogue, restraint, and a return to civilian rule. You could probably argue that if there is any return to civilian rule, they're probably backed by the military anyway. And then it's ECOWAS, which I think is like the Eastern African Association of something. They have condemned the coup, and they are engaging transitional authorities through diplomatic measures, which presumably means they're talking to the military about who they're going to put in after the 12-month transitional period.
Weak language is something we've come across a lot on this podcast, where laws are made that can be interpreted in any shape or form that suits your government. You just spoke about the regional response. Who doesn't remember Good Luck Jonathan, former president of
the
Nigeria?
Nigerian dude. Yeah.
With that name, you cannot forget him. He also responded to the coup, and he says, this is a really interesting term, what happened in Guinea-Bissau was not a coup. For want of a better word, I would say it was a ceremonial coup.
Well, there you go.
What's your thought on that? It's almost a ceremony.
Well,
It's like something you do every Sunday.
Or a Christmas party.
Yeah.
there is some sort of like conjecture about the coup, which I heard in a podcast, which is that the current guy, President Embaló, has actually instigated it himself. I know it sounds crazy.
That's
but-
bizarre. So
No, baby, you can still put it on. You don't have to me.
So
It's okay. So he instigated himself because he's going to get put into the like transitional role, but also, and I think I mentioned this earlier, was that the coup and the like all the stuff that's going on is more about drug profits.
So in terms of, if we look broadly speaking at Africa, there are a lot of intractable conflicts, mainly to do with the natural resources of countries and, you know, the riches of the land. Guinea-Bissau obviously doesn't have that. They have cashews and cocaine. Are there any external actors who are involved, or is it just simply a small country that people generally ignore? They might offer platitudes when the buyout, the coup every 2 years takes place, but they're really not that interested. Or maybe they are at just making sure that the drug money continues to flow, and who knows how many of the neighbours are actually maybe taking a cut by not getting involved.
And does Portugal still play a role, like we've learned from Madagascar, where France still has a strong interest?
Portugal apparently does still play a role. There is an organisation of the Portuguese-speaking world, so obviously it includes Brazil, Portugal, Angola, Mozambique.
So it's equivalent to the Commonwealth of Nations. But in
Yeah,
Portuguese.
pretty much. I've heard and I've read that Portugal will bring pressure on them.
Doesn't seem to work.
What does that mean? And what's Portugal going to do about it? I suppose would be the second question. I mean, I suppose my question would be, who's actually heard of Guinea-Bissau before now? Anybody?
Have heard of it.
Did you know it was where it was in Africa?
I knew roughly where it was, and it makes sense that it's kind of part of the cocaine route between South America and Europe. I'd be interested to know who else funds that journey. I'm also fascinated to find out who are the recipients of the cashew exports from Guinea-Bissau.
I had heard of the country, did not know anything about it, but I think that the cashews and the cocaine go in through Rotterdam, which seems to be where everything else enters Europe these days.
Yeah, it is actually through Europe.
As we've learned today on Putschcast, a very, very special episode. There are ambitious governments out there. Some might be genuine, others may not be. Nepal, 6 months. Fresh elections, new system, kickstart the country, especially the economy. We learned 2 years is what the military plans in Madagascar. And who sits right there in the middle? It's the military who just took over in Guinea-Bissau. From the heart, James, where do you think the country is heading?
I think Guinea-Bissau is headed to a terrible place. And there are 3 C's which could sum up the country. Cashews, coups, and cocaine.
Putschcast. Follow us on Facebook or Instagram to find out about the latest coup coming your way.
New Year's Eve is not far off. Let's hope there's not another coup, because we won't have time to cover it. And I'm also sorry for the people who are affected by it, because as we've learned today, it's very, very rare that there's a velvet coup or change of power. However, we're also not naive, and we know next year there will be more coups, more revolts, rebellions, revolutions, and uprisings. So make sure you tune in to Putschcast. We've given you a bit of a teaser before. We've got Thomas Münzer coming up. If you don't know who he is,
Very engaging expert from Vancouver talking to us about the radical theologians in 16th century Germany.
but we're also learning more about Nat Turner. We're talking 19th century USA.
That's right, the 1830s in the USA. We are headed to North America for the first time on Putschcast.
And James, you are tackling a really big one, the end of World War I in Germany.
Okay, guys, if you're old enough, you may remember that the Kaiser had to abdicate in 1918, so tune in.
All right, that's us done. Thank you so much for the year. Thank you so much for listening, telling all your friends about it. Make sure you give us a like and a share until we push out the next episode.
Happy Christmas.
Putschcast, a global podcast about riots, rebellions, revolutions, and the intoxication of power.